A shelter. Poppy chooses a man and refuses to let him go, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep unless he's by her side. No one understands why. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe our channel, Pause Verve. If this story touches your heart, please like the video and share it with others. The Oregon coast stretched out in a grey, restless sprawl, the ocean churning under a sky heavy with November clouds. Caleb Hart gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Jeep, the hum of the engine a steady counterpoint to the unease coiling in his chest. At 32, the ex-Marine looked older than his years, his dark hair flecked with premature grey, his hazel eyes shadowed by memories he'd rather leave buried. 6 weeks of mandatory medical leave loomed ahead, an unwelcome gift from a military doctor who'd seen too much in Caleb's rigid posture and clipped responses. He hadn't asked for the break, hadn't wanted it, but the orders were clear. Rest, recover, report back. So here he was, driving the winding coastal highway toward Tidewater, a sleepy town of salt-worn cottages and driftwood-strewn beaches, where his older brother Nate had promised him a place to crash. The road curved past cliffs that dropped sharply to the sea, and Caleb's gaze flicked to the waves below, their relentless crash mirroring the thoughts he couldn't outrun. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, another call from his former squadmate Javi checking in. Caleb let it go to voicemail, just as he had the last 3. Javi meant well, but talking felt like peeling back scar tissue, and Caleb wasn't ready for that. Not now, maybe not ever. The sign for Tidewater appeared through the mist, its faded letters barely legible against the weathered wood. Welcome to Tidewater, where the sea meets the soul. Caleb snorted softly. Soul was the last thing he was looking to find. He turned onto a narrow street lined with cedar-shingled houses, their porches adorned with wind chimes and lobster traps repurposed as planters. Nate's cottage sat at the end of the lane, a squat, grey-blue building with white trim and a widow's walk that looked out over the Pacific. The sight of it tugged at something deep in Caleb's chest, a memory of childhood summers spent chasing crabs on the beach, Nate laughing as he pretended to be outrun by his scrawny younger brother. Those days felt like they belonged to someone. Else now. He pulled into the gravel driveway, the Jeep's tires crunching softly, and cut the engine. For a moment he just sat there, staring at the cottage. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the distant cry of a gull cut through the quiet. Home, or as close to it as he'd get. Before he could reach for his duffel bag, the front door swung open and Nate stepped onto the porch, his flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows despite the chill. At 36, Nate had the easy grin of someone who'd made peace with life's rough edges. He ran a hand through his sandy hair, his eyes crinkling as he took in his brother's arrival. "Well, look who finally showed up," Nate called, his voice warm but laced with the gentle ribbing only a sibling could pull off. "Thought you'd gotten lost somewhere in Idaho." Caleb managed a half-smile, sliding out of the Jeep. "Not lost. Just taking the scenic route." His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in days, which wasn't far from the truth. He grabbed his bag and climbed the porch steps, where Nate pulled him into a quick, firm hug. Caleb stiffened at first, his arms slow to return the embrace, but Nate didn't let go until he felt his brother relax, even if just a fraction. "Good to have you here, man," Nate said, stepping back to study Caleb. His smile faltered slightly, catching the tension in Caleb's jaw, the way his eyes avoided lingering too long on anything. But Nate, ever the optimist, recovered quickly. "Come on, I've got coffee on and the guest room's ready. Fair warning, though, there's a seagull that's decided the roof is his personal stage at 5 a.m. Caleb followed him inside, the cottage's warmth enveloping him. The living room smelled of cedar and old books, with a worn leather couch facing a stone fireplace. A driftwood sculpture sat on the mantel, and a faded quilt hung over the back of a rocking chair, touches of their late mother who'd loved this place. Nate led him to the kitchen, where a pot of coffee gurgled on the counter. "You still take it black?" Nate asked, already pouring a mug. "Yeah," Caleb said, setting his bag by the door. He took the mug, the heat seeping into his palms, and leaned against the counter, watching Nate move with the ease of someone who belonged here. Tidewater was Nate's world now. He ran a small hardware store downtown and coached the local kids' soccer team. Caleb, on the other hand, felt like a stranger. his years in the Marines carving a distance he wasn't sure how to bridge. Nate sipped his coffee, studying Caleb over the rim of his mug. "So, what's the plan? 6 weeks is a long time to just sit around staring at the ocean." "No plan," Caleb admitted, his tone flat. "Just getting through it." Nate nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Well, if you get bored, there's plenty to do. Community's got a donation drive. Going for the animal shelter. I was going to drop some stuff off tomorrow. You could tag along, keep me company." Caleb's instinct was to decline, to retreat to the guest room and let the days blur together. But something in Nate's voice, hopeful, not pushy, made him pause. "Maybe," he said, which was as close to a yes as he could manage. That night, Caleb lay in the guest room, the sound of waves filtering through the cracked window. The bed was soft, the quilt heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind replayed fragments of his last deployment, the dust, the shouts, the moment he'd made, a choice he couldn't undo. He closed his eyes, willing the memories away, but they lingered like the tide, pulling him under. Little did he know tomorrow's visit to the shelter would introduce him to a puppy who'd change everything, a small spark of light in the darkness he'd been carrying for too long. The morning dawned damp and grey, the kind of coastal gloom that seeped into your bones. Caleb Hart stood at the kitchen counter in Nate's cottage, staring at a cooling cup of coffee, while his brother bustled around, loading a cardboard box with old blankets and a bag of dog food. The animal shelter donation drive had been Nate's idea, a way to nudge Caleb out of the haze he'd been drifting in since arriving in Tidewater. Caleb hadn't committed to going, but when Nate tossed him the Jeep keys with a "you're driving," he didn't argue. Something about the weight of the keys in his hand felt grounding, like a mission, however small. The Tidewater Animal Shelter sat on the edge of town, a low brick building with peeling paint and a chain-link fence enclosing a muddy play yard. As Caleb pulled into the gravel lot, the Jeep's tires crunched softly, and he scanned the area out of habit. Exits, sightlines, potential threats. Old instincts died hard. Nate hopped out, hefting the donation box, and Caleb followed, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The air smelled of wet fur and pine, and a faint chorus of barks echoed from inside. "Morning, Nate." A woman in a navy fleece vest greeted them at the entrance, her name tag reading Clara. Her graying braid swung as she took the box from Nate with a grateful smile. "And you must be Caleb. Nate said you might come. Thanks for the supplies. We're stretched thin this month." Caleb nodded, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "No problem." His voice was low, clipped, the kind of tone that discouraged small talk. Clara didn't push, instead leading them through the lobby, where a bulletin board displayed photos of adopted pets and a handwritten sign begged for volunteers. "Want a quick tour?" Clara asked, setting the box on a counter. "We've got some real sweethearts back there." Nate glanced at Caleb, eyebrows raised, clearly hoping he'd agree. Caleb's first instinct was to say no. Crowded kennels and eager animals sounded like more energy than he had to give. But the alternative was returning to the cottage, where the quiet would press in again. "Sure," he said, surprising himself. Clara led them through a heavy door into the kennel area, where the noise hit like a wave. Barks and whines bounced off the concrete walls, and puppies of every size pressed against their cage doors, tails wagging furiously. A terrier mix yipped for attention, while a hound puppy howled mournfully. Caleb's jaw tightened, the cacophony jarring his nerves, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale like he'd been taught to steady himself. "Most of these guys are strays or surrenders," Clara explained, weaving down the aisle. "But we got a few from a bad situation last month. A backyard breeder got shut down. Poor things were kept in crates too small to turn around in." Caleb's eyes flicked to the cages as they passed, noting the hopeful gazes and the occasional tremble of fear. He kept his hands in his pockets, his posture rigid, until they reached the last kennel, tucked in a corner where the light barely reached. Unlike the others, this puppy wasn't barking or pacing. A young Labrador retriever, maybe 6 months old, lay curled against the back wall, her golden fur dulled by patches of missing hair. Scars crisscrossed her flanks, faint but unmistakable, and her left front leg rested at an awkward angle, as if it pained her to put weight on it. Her amber eyes locked onto Caleb's, wary but piercing, like she was sizing him up. "That's one of the breeder rescues," Clara said softly, pausing beside Caleb. "She was in rough shape when we got her, malnourished, scared of her own shadow, won't let anyone close, not even to check her wounds properly. We haven't named her yet. She doesn't seem to trust enough to care." Caleb stopped walking, his boots rooted to the floor. The puppy's gaze hadn't wavered, and something about it felt familiar, like looking into a mirror of his own guarded caution. He took a step closer, slow and deliberate, ignoring the way Clara's breath caught. The puppy didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, she unfolded herself, rising to her feet with a slight limp, and limped toward the bars. Her movements were cautious, testing, but purposeful. When she reached the edge of the kennel, she lowered her head and gently rested it on Caleb's boot, her eyes never leaving his. Clara gasped, a quiet sound that broke the spell. "I've never seen her do that," she whispered. "She's backed away from everyone, volunteers, vets, even me." Caleb crouched down, his movements careful, like he was approaching a tripwire. Up close, he could see the depth of her scars, the way her ribs pressed against her skin. But it was her eyes that held him, steady, searching, like she saw something in him no one else had bothered to look for. "Hey, girl," he murmured, his voice softer than it had been in months. The puppy's tail gave a single, tentative wag, and Caleb felt a crack in the walls he'd built around himself, small but undeniable. Nate, standing a few steps back, watched with a mix of surprise and hope. "She likes you, man," he said, keeping his voice light. "That's gotta mean something." Caleb didn't respond, still locked in that silent exchange with the puppy. He wasn't sure what it meant, only that it felt like a lifeline, fragile, but real. Clara cleared her throat. "If you're interested, we could talk about adoption. She'll need a lot of care, patience too, but I think she's chosen you." The word adoption landed like a stone in Caleb's gut. He wasn't ready for responsibility, not when he could barely manage himself, but as he looked at the puppy, her head still resting on his boot, he felt a pull he couldn't explain, a spark of warmth in the cold grey fog of his days. For the first time since arriving in Tidewater, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could be something more than a ghost passing through. Caleb Hart sat in the Tidewater Animal Shelter's cramped office, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead doing little to ease the knot in his stomach. The adoption paperwork lay spread across a metal desk, a flurry of forms and checkboxes that felt more like a mission briefing than a commitment to a puppy. Clara, the shelter worker, walked him through each page with practiced efficiency, her voice gentle but firm as she outlined the responsibilities: regular vet visits, a stable environment, patience for the puppy's trauma. Caleb's pen hovered over the final signature line, his mind wrestling with doubt. He wasn't built for this, not anymore. But the memory of the Labrador Retriever puppy's amber eyes, steady and trusting as she rested her head on his boot, anchored him. He scrawled his name, the ink sealing a choice he still didn't fully understand. "She's yours now," Clara said, her smile warm as she handed him a thin folder with vet records and care instructions. "We're calling her a Labrador Retriever, but she's probably got some mix in there. 6 months old, give or take. What do you want to name her?" Caleb paused, the question catching him off guard. A name felt like a promise, something permanent in a life that had felt anything but. He thought of the puppy's quiet resilience, the faint glow in her eyes despite her scars. "Ember," he said finally, the word slipping out like it had been waiting. "Her name's Ember." Clara nodded, jotting it down. "Fits her. There's a spark in that one, even after everything." Back at Nate's cottage, Caleb carried Ember inside, her slight weight trembling in his arms. She'd been quiet during the drive, curled tightly in the passenger seat, her injured leg tucked beneath her. The shelter had given her a quick bath, but her golden fur was still patchy, her ribs too prominent under his hands. He set her down on the living room floor, expecting her to explore, but Ember stayed close, pressing against his leg, as if afraid. He'd vanish. Her eyes tracked his every move, wary but unwavering, and Caleb felt the weight of her trust settle over him like a mantle. Nate, sprawled on the couch with a soccer game muted on the TV, watched with a grin. "Look at that, she's already got you on a leash." He tossed a bag of dog treats onto the coffee table. "Picked these up while you were signing your life away. Figured you'd need 'em." "Thanks," Caleb said, his voice gruff. He opened the bag and offered a treat to Ember, holding it out in his palm. She sniffed it cautiously, her nose twitching, but didn't eat. Instead, she looked up at him, waiting, as if needing permission. "Go on, girl," he murmured, softening his tone. Only then did she take the treat, her teeth gentle, her eyes never leaving his. That first evening set the pattern. Ember refused to eat unless Caleb was in the room, her bowl untouched until he sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor beside her. She wouldn't sleep unless he was close, her small body curled tightly against his boots when he sat at the table, or later, when he moved to the couch. Nate noticed it too, his teasing giving way to quiet observation. "She's glued to you, man," he said one night, glancing at Ember's sleeping form by Caleb's feet, "like she's scared you'll bolt if she blinks." Caleb didn't respond, but the words hit home. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that came from losing too much to believe in anything lasting. He saw it in Ember's flinch at sudden noises, the way she froze when Nate's phone buzzed too loudly. Her scars told a story of neglect, of a world that had taught her to expect pain instead of kindness. Yet here she was, choosing him, trusting him despite it all. It stirred something in Caleb, a warmth he hadn't felt in years, mingled with a fear of failing her. The next morning, Caleb woke to find Ember lying at the foot of his bed, her chin resting on his ankle. She hadn't climbed up during the night, as if respecting his space, but she'd stayed as close as she could. The guest room was dim, the ocean's murmur filtering through the window, and for a moment Caleb just watched her breathe, her chest rising and falling with a steadiness that calmed his own racing pulse. He hadn't slept through the night in months, but last night, with Ember's quiet presence, the nightmares had stayed at bay. He slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb her, and pulled on a sweater. Ember's eyes snapped open, and she scrambled to her feet, limping slightly as she followed him to the kitchen. Caleb filled her water bowl, noting how she waited for him to nod before drinking. "You're a stubborn one," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't realize he was speaking aloud, until Ember's tail gave a small wag, like she understood. As he brewed coffee, Caleb glanced at the care instructions Clara had given him. Ember needed a vet check for her leg, a diet to build her strength, and time to heal from her past. The list felt daunting, but it also gave him something to focus on, something other than the memories that crept in when the world was too quiet. He knelt beside Ember, running a hand gently over her head, careful to avoid her sensitive spots. "We'll figure this out, okay?" he said, his voice low. Ember leaned into his touch, her warmth seeping into his palm, and for the first time since leaving the Marines, Caleb felt a flicker of purpose. Outside, the tide rolled in, steady and unyielding. And Caleb looked at Ember, her eyes bright with a trust he didn't yet feel he deserved. He didn't know why she'd chosen him, or what it meant for the weeks ahead. But in that moment, with her small body pressed against his, he knew he couldn't walk away, not from her. The Tidewater cottage was bathed in the soft glow of early morning, the kind of light that made the ocean outside shimmer like liquid silver. Caleb Hart stood at the kitchen counter, measuring out a precise portion of high-calorie puppy food for Ember, the Labrador Retriever puppy who'd become his shadow in the few days since her adoption. Her amber eyes followed his every move, her body pressed close to his leg as he set the bowl on the floor. She didn't eat immediately, waiting for his nod, a ritual they'd fallen into without Caleb fully realizing it. "Go ahead, girl," he said softly, and only then did she lower her head to eat, her tail giving a faint wag. The sight of her trust, so hard-earned, stirred a warmth in Caleb's chest that felt foreign but not unwelcome. Their days began to take on a rhythm, a quiet structure that anchored Caleb in a way he hadn't expected. Morning started with a walk along the beach, where the sand was cool and the waves provided a steady backdrop. Ember's limp was still noticeable, but she kept pace with Caleb, her nose twitching at the scent of seaweed and driftwood. He noticed how she stayed within arm's reach, her eyes flicking to him whenever a gull swooped too close or a wave crashed too loudly. Her wariness mirrored his own hypervigilance, a habit from years of scanning for threats in dusty villages, half a world away. "We're a pair, huh?" he muttered one morning, and Ember's ears perked as if agreeing. Training became their shared language. Caleb, drawing on his marine discipline, started with simple hand signals. A flat palm for sit, 2 fingers pointing down for stay, a gentle wave for come. Ember learned quickly, her intelligence shining through despite her timid demeanor. She'd sit at his signal, her posture attentive, and when he waved her over, she'd limp to his side with a focus that reminded Caleb of his squad mates following orders under pressure. He rewarded her with small treats and quiet praise, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Good girl, Ember," he'd say, and her tail would wag, a small victory that made his throat tighten. Nate noticed the change too. One evening, as Caleb sat on the cottage's back porch teaching Ember to stay while he tossed a tennis ball a few feet away, Nate leaned against the railing, a beer in hand. "She's got you wrapped around her paw," he said, his grin teasing but warm. "Never thought I'd see you playing dog trainer, but it suits you." Caleb shrugged, keeping his eyes on Ember, who held her stay despite the ball's tempting roll. "Keeps me busy." It was more than that, though. Training Ember gave him purpose, a mission that didn't end in loss. When she nailed a command, her eyes bright with pride, it felt like a step towards something better, for both of them. The true depth of their bond revealed itself one stormy night, a week into Ember's stay. The wind howled outside, rattling the cottage's windows, and thunder rolled in from the sea like artillery fire. Caleb lay in bed, his heart pounding as a familiar nightmare took hold. Sand and heat, the weight of his rifle, a boy's face frozen in fear before the world exploded. He jerked awake, a gasp tearing from his throat, his t-shirt soaked with sweat. His hands shook as he tried to ground himself, counting breaths like his therapist had once suggested, but the panic wouldn't relent. Then he felt it, a cold, wet nudge against his hand. Ember, who'd been sleeping at the foot of his bed, had crawled closer, her nose pressing insistently against his palm. She didn't bark or whine, just leaned her small, warm body against his, her eyes steady in the dim light. Caleb's breathing hitched, but he focused on her warmth, her quiet presence. "Okay, girl," he whispered, his voice raw. He matched his breaths to hers, slow and deliberate, and gradually the vice around his chest loosened. Ember stayed, there her head resting on his arm, until he could breathe without effort. For the first time in months, the nightmare didn't consume him. The next morning, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, a notepad open in front of him. He'd started jotting down Ember's progress, her response to commands, her improving appetite, the way her limp was less pronounced with regular walks. But he also wrote about that night, the way she'd pulled him back from the edge without being asked. He didn't know how she'd sensed his distress, but it felt like more than instinct. It felt like understanding, like she'd seen the same kind of darkness and knew how to navigate it. He took Ember to the vet that afternoon, a small clinic in town with a cheerful receptionist and a vet named Dr. Patel, who examined Ember with gentle hands. "She's healing well," Dr. Patel said, checking Ember's leg. "The limp should fade with time and proper care, but her emotional recovery, that's where you're making the difference. She trusts you, and that's huge for a puppy with her history." Caleb nodded, his hand resting on Ember's head as she leaned against him. "She's tough," he said, and Dr. Patel smiled, catching the pride in his voice. Back at the cottage, Caleb set up a small corner for Ember, a blanket folded into a bed, a water bowl, a rope toy Nate had bought. She didn't use it much, preferring to stay by Caleb's side, but he liked knowing she had a space of her own. It felt like a promise to her, and to himself, that he was in this for the long haul. As the days passed, Caleb began to notice small changes in himself. His shoulders weren't as tight, his sleep less fractured. Ember's presence was a constant, a reminder that he wasn't alone, even when the past tried to pull him under. She was more than a puppy. She was a partner, a survivor who'd chosen him as much as he'd chosen her. And in that choice, Caleb glimpsed a path forward, one he hadn't dared to imagine before. The tidewater morning was crisp, the air carrying a bite that hinted at winter's approach. Caleb Hart knelt on the cottage's back porch, adjusting a makeshift ramp he'd built from scrap wood to help Ember, his Labrador Retriever puppy, navigate the steps with her healing leg. She sat nearby, her amber eyes tracking his movements, her tail giving a soft thump against the weathered boards when he glanced her way. The routine they'd built over the past 2 weeks, walks on the beach, training sessions, quiet evenings by the fireplace, had become a lifeline, steadying Caleb in ways he hadn't thought possible. Ember's presence dulled the edges of his nightmares, her warmth a counterweight to the guilt that still woke him in the dark. But as Caleb hammered the final nail into the ramp, his phone buzzed on the porch railing, the screen flashing a name that made his stomach tighten. Major Reynolds. His commanding officer had been leaving voicemails for days, each one a reminder of the life Caleb had left behind in the Marines. He'd ignored them, hoping distance would keep the military at bay, but the buzzing felt like a warning shot. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered, his voice clipped. "Hart." "Captain Hart," Reynolds said, his tone all business. "You've been dodging my calls. Medical leave doesn't mean you're off the grid." "Been busy, sir." Caleb replied, his eyes on Ember, who tilted her head as if sensing the shift in his mood. "Busy's no excuse. Your eval's scheduled for next week. We need to discuss your return to active duty." A pause, heavy with expectation. "And I got a report about unauthorized housing. You're in base assigned quarters part-time, correct?" Caleb's grip tightened on the phone. When he'd arrived in Tidewater, the Marines had arranged temporary housing on a nearby reserve base for administrative check-ins, a small apartment he used sparingly, preferring Nate's cottage. But the apartment came, with rules, and Caleb had brought Ember there a few times, her leash tucked under his arm as he slipped past the "No Pets Allowed" sign. "Yes, sir," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "I've been splitting time." "Then you know the regulations," Reynolds said. "No animals in base housing without clearance. Emotional support. Animal certification requires medical. Documentation and command approval. You got that paperwork?" Caleb's jaw clenched. He'd heard of ESAs, had even considered it after Ember's uncanny ability to calm his panic attacks, but the process sounded like a maze, therapy sessions, psych evaluations, forms he wasn't ready to face. "Not yet, sir," he admitted. "I'm working on it." "Work faster," Reynolds said. "I'm sending an inspector to your unit tomorrow, 0800 hours. If there's a dog there without clearance, it's a violation. You know what that means." "Yes, sir." Caleb ended the call, his hand lingering on the phone as the weight of Reynolds' words settled. A violation could mean fines, disciplinary action, or worse, Ember being removed to a shelter or holding facility. The thought of her back in a cage, alone and scared, made his chest ache. He looked at her now, chewing contentedly on a rope. Toy, her trust in him absolute. He couldn't let her down. Caleb stood, pacing the porch as Ember followed, her limp barely noticeable, but still a reminder of her fragility. He needed a plan. The shelter's adoption folder included a pamphlet on ESA certification, and he dug it out from a drawer, scanning the requirements. A diagnosed mental health condition, a letter from a licensed therapist, proof of the animal's training and behavior. Caleb had none of those. He'd avoided therapy since his discharge, unwilling to unpack the memories of his last deployment. The boy, the grenade, the choice that cost him a piece of himself. But for Ember, he'd have to try. He called Nate, who was at the hardware store, and explained the situation. "You think you can keep her at the cottage for a bit?" Caleb asked. "Just until I sort this out." "Sure thing," Nate said, his voice steady. "But Caleb, you gotta get that paperwork. She's not just a pet, she's helping you, even I can see that." "I know," Caleb said, his throat tight. "I'll figure it out." That afternoon, Caleb drove to the base apartment, a stark, one-bedroom unit that smelled of fresh paint and bleach. He'd kept it sparse, uniforms in the closet, a few books on a shelf, no photos. Ember's water bowl and a chew toy sat in the corner, evidence he couldn't hide. He packed them into a duffel bag, then swept the floor for fur, his movements methodical but urgent. As he worked, he thought of Ember's scars, her refusal to eat without him, the way she'd nudged him awake from nightmares. She wasn't just a puppy, she was his anchor, and the military's rules felt like a threat to the one thing keeping him steady. Back at the cottage, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a laptop, searching for local therapists who worked with veterans. The idea of sitting in an office spilling his guts to a stranger made his skin crawl, but he bookmarked a few names, including a Dr. Lauren Miles, whose website mentioned trauma and ESA certifications. Ember lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot, and Caleb reached down to scratch her ears. "We're not losing you," he said, his voice firm. "Not a chance." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb felt a flicker of determination. The military had trained him to face impossible odds, to adapt and overcome. This was just another mission, one where the stakes were higher than ever. Ember's soft breathing was a reminder of what he was fighting for, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt ready to fight, not just for himself, but for the puppy who'd chosen him. The dawn broke, over tidewater with a deceptive calm, the sky a pale wash of pink and gold that belied the storm brewing in Caleb Hart's world. He stood in the kitchen of Nate's cottage, his hands steady as he filled Ember's water bowl, but his mind was a tangle of worry. The Labrador Retriever puppy sat at his feet, her amber eyes fixed on him with that unwavering trust that had become his lifeline. Yesterday's call from Major Reynolds had lit a fuse. Base housing inspection at 800 hours, no unauthorized animals allowed. Caleb had spent the night preparing, moving Ember's belongings to the cottage and scrubbing the base apartment clean of any trace of her. But the threat of losing her loomed like a shadow, and the weight of it pressed against his chest. Caleb had arranged for Ember to stay with Nate during the inspection, a temporary measure until he could secure the Emotional Support Animal ESA certification. He'd even called Dr. Lauren Miles, the therapist, and left a voicemail requesting an urgent appointment. But as he loaded Ember into the Jeep for the short drive to the base, her leash coiled in his hand, a sense of unease gnawed at him. She sensed it too, her usual excitement for car rides replaced by a quiet tension, her body pressed close to his leg as he drove. The base apartment was as sterile as Caleb had left it, the air heavy with the scent of cleaning supplies. He'd planned to drop off a few documents and leave, keeping Ember in the Jeep, but a knock at the door shattered that plan. Major Reynolds stood there, flanked by 2 military police officers, their expressions unreadable. "Captain Hart," Reynolds said, his voice clipped. "Routine inspection. Step aside." Caleb's heart sank, but he complied, gesturing for Ember to stay by the couch. She obeyed, her body low, her eyes darting between Caleb and the strangers. Reynolds' gaze zeroed in on her immediately, his jaw tightening. "I thought I made myself clear, Hart. No animals without clearance." "Sir, I'm working on the ESA paperwork," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his throat. "She's not staying here. She's with my brother. I just brought her for the morning." "Doesn't matter." Reynolds. "Cut in. She's here now and that's a violation." He nodded to the MPs. "Remove the animal, holding facility, standard protocol." "Sir, please," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "She's got trauma issues. A kennel will set her back. I have a therapist appointment tomorrow. Let me get the paperwork through." Reynolds' expression softened for a fraction of a second, but his tone remained firm. "Rules are rules, Captain. You can visit her once you file the proper forms." He stepped back, and the MPs moved toward Ember, one holding a leash. Ember didn't growl or snap, but her body trembled, her eyes locked on Caleb as if pleading for him to intervene. He knelt beside her, his hand on her head, whispering, "It's okay, girl, I'll get you back." The words felt hollow, but he forced them out, for her sake as much as his. The MP clipped the leash to her collar, and Ember went reluctantly, her head low, looking back at Caleb with every step. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed was deafening. Caleb drove to the holding facility, a squat concrete building on the base's outskirts, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The clerk at the desk was indifferent, her voice monotone as she explained the process. Visitation by appointment, command approval required, 3 to 5 days for processing. "She needs special care," Caleb said, his voice sharp. "She's not just any dog. She's got a history of neglect." "File the paperwork," the clerk replied, barely looking up. "That's all I can tell you." Caleb walked out, the chain-link fence around the facility glinting in the sunlight like a cage. He could imagine Ember inside, alone in a concrete kennel, her trust in him fraying with every passing hour. The thought was unbearable, and he slammed his fist against the Jeep's hood, the pain grounding him just enough to keep moving. He called Nate, his voice rough as he explained what happened. "Can you check with the shelter?" he asked. "See if they know anything about holding facilities, how to get her out faster." "On it," Nate said, his usual lightness replaced by urgency. "You okay, Caleb?" "No," Caleb admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop it. "But I will be when she's back." That evening, Caleb sat at the cottage's kitchen table, a blank ESA application form in front of him. His hands shook as he tried to write, the words blurring with frustration. Ember's absence was a physical ache, her water bowl untouched, her rope toy lying abandoned by the door. He thought of her scars, her limp, the way she'd fought to survive a world that had tried to break her. She'd chosen him, trusted him, and now she was paying for it. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Nate. "Shelter says holding facility has a history of bad latches. Dogs have escaped before. Stay sharp." Caleb's heart skipped. If Ember got out, she'd be scared, injured, and loose in unfamiliar territory. But she was smart and she knew him. If she escaped, she'd try to find him. Caleb grabbed his jacket and keys, his mind racing through their routines, the beach paths they walked, the quiet corner of the park where they trained. He drove to the base, parking near the holding facility, and scanned the area for any sign of her. The night was dark, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and Caleb's hope battled his fear. Ember was out there somewhere, and he wouldn't stop until he found her. She'd fought her way to him once before, and he'd be damned if he let her down now. The Tidewater night was thick with fog, the streetlights casting hazy halos as Caleb Hart sat in his Jeep outside the base holding facility. His eyes were fixed on the chain-link fence, searching for any sign of Ember, the Labrador Retriever puppy who'd been taken from him hours ago. The shelter's warning about faulty latches had ignited a fragile hope. She might have escaped, might be out, there looking for him. But as the hours ticked by with no trace of her, that hope began to fray, replaced by a gnawing fear. Ember was injured, scared and alone, and Caleb felt the weight of his failure to protect her like a stone in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he fought the urge to storm the facility and demand answers. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his spiral. A text from Nate. "No luck at the shelter. They're spreading the word." "You checked the beach yet?" Caleb's mind flashed to their morning walks, the way Ember's nose would twitch at the scent of salt and kelp, her limp easing as she trotted beside him. It was a long shot, but it was somewhere to start. He started the Jeep and drove toward the coast, the fog parting slightly as he reached the familiar stretch of sand near Nate's cottage. The beach was deserted, the waves a low rumble under the mist. Caleb walked their usual path, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, calling Ember's name in a voice rough with desperation. "Ember, come on, girl." The wind swallowed his words, and the emptiness of the night pressed in. He checked the driftwood pile where she liked to sniff, the rocky outcrop where they'd practiced sit, but there was nothing, no paw prints, no flash of golden fur. His chest tightened, the familiar panic rising, but without Ember's steady presence to ground him, it felt like drowning. He sank onto a piece of driftwood, his head in his hands, and let the truth hit him. He couldn't do this alone. Not finding Ember, not navigating the military's red tape, not facing the memories that clawed at him every night. He'd been running from help for too long, thinking he could outlast his pain if he just kept moving. But Ember had changed. She'd shown him what it meant to trust, to heal, and now she needed him to fight for her. That meant doing the one thing he'd avoided since leaving the Marines, asking for help. Caleb pulled out his phone and found the number for Dr. Lauren Miles, the therapist he'd contacted before the inspection. It was late, nearly midnight, but he dialed anyway, his heart pounding as the line rang. A calm, professional voicemail answered, "This is Dr. Lauren Miles. If this is an emergency, please leave a message," and I'll return your call as soon as possible." Caleb hesitated, then spoke, his voice low but steady. "This is Caleb Hart. I called yesterday about an ESA certification. My puppy, Ember. She's missing, taken by the base. I need help. I'm ready to do the work." He left his number and hung up, the act of reaching out feeling like a small victory even if it terrified him. He drove back to the cottage, exhaustion settling into his bones, and found Nate waiting on the porch, a thermos of coffee in hand. "Any sign?" Nate asked, his eyes searching Caleb's face. Caleb shook his head, the word sticking in his throat. "I called a therapist, gonna start sessions, get the ESA paperwork moving." Nate's eyebrows rose, but he didn't push. "Good, that's good, man, we'll find her. Clara's got every shelter in the county on alert, and I'm checking the neighborhood tomorrow." Caleb nodded, grateful for his brother's steadiness. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table, Ember's rope toy in his hands, its frayed edges a reminder of her absence. He opened his laptop and started drafting an appeal to the base housing office, detailing Ember's role in his life, her ability to sense his nightmares, her calming presence during panic attacks. The words came haltingly, but they were honest, a step toward proving she was more than a pet. He didn't know if it would be enough, but it was something to hold on to. At 6 a.m., his phone rang, startling him awake from a fitful doze. "Mr. Hart, this is Dr. Lauren Miles," a warm, steady voice said. "I got your message. I'm sorry about Ember. Can you come to my office this morning? I'd like to start working on your case." Caleb rubbed his eyes, the fog of sleeplessness clearing slightly. "Yeah, I'll be there." Dr. Miles's office was a small cedar-shingled building downtown, its waiting room lined with plants and soft blue walls that felt more like a home than a clinic. Dr. Miles, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted him with a handshake. "Let's talk about you and Ember," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "Tell me what she means to you." Caleb's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak, starting with the shelter, Ember's scars, the way she'd chosen him. He described her nudging him awake from nightmares, her steady presence on the beach, the hole her absence had left. "She's not just a puppy," he said, his voice rough. "She's why I'm still here trying." Dr. Miles nodded, her pen moving across a notepad. "That's a powerful connection. I'm going to recommend an immediate PTSD evaluation and start documenting your need for an ESA. But Caleb, this process requires therapy, weekly sessions, maybe more. Are you ready for that?" Caleb thought of Ember, alone somewhere, her trust in him hanging by a thread. He thought of the boy from his last deployment, the choice he couldn't undo, and how Ember had given him a reason to face it. "I'm ready," he said, the words carrying a conviction he hadn't felt in years. As he left the office, a text from Nate buzzed through. "Neighbor saw a limping puppy near the pier. Get here now." Caleb's heart leaped, hope and fear colliding. He was closer to saving Ember, but he needed her to hold on just a little longer. With Dr. Miles's support and a new resolve, he was ready to fight for their future, no matter what it took. The Tidewater morning was sharp and clear, the sky a rare unbroken blue that reflected off the ocean like a promise. Caleb Hart stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Nate's cottage, adjusting the collar of his marine dress uniform with a precision born of years of habit. Each pin and ribbon was perfectly aligned, a silent testament to his service, but his hazel eyes held a new resolve. Beside him, Ember, his Labrador retriever puppy, sat attentively, her golden fur gleaming under the new black vest that read, "ISA candidate." Her limp was barely noticeable now, her amber eyes bright with the same trust that had carried them through the past weeks. Today was the day they'd face the Military Housing Board, fighting for her certification as an emotional support animal and their right to stay together. The call from Nate the previous night had been a miracle. Caleb had raced to the pier, heart pounding, and found Ember huddled beneath a bench, muddy and trembling but alive. She'd limped toward him with a whimper, collapsing into his arms, her tail wagging weakly despite her exhaustion. A vet check confirmed she was dehydrated but intact, her injuries from the escape, scraped pads and a strained leg, minor but telling of her desperate journey to find him. Caleb hadn't let her out of his sight since, and with Dr. Lauren Miles's help, he'd spent the last 2 days preparing for the hearing, armed with documentation and a determination to prove Ember's necessity. The base hearing room was a stark contrast to the coastal warmth outside, its fluorescent lights and beige walls exuding institutional coldness. 3 officers sat behind a long table, their uniforms crisp, their faces neutral. Colonel Vargas, the board chair, flanked by Major Kim and Captain Ellis. Major Reynolds stood in the corner, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Nate and Clara from the shelter sat in the back row, their presence a quiet show of support. Caleb took his place at the podium, Ember settling beside his left boot, her posture calm but alert, as if she understood the stakes. Colonel Vargas cleared his throat, his voice measured. "Captain Hart, you're here to appeal for emotional support animal certification and special base housing clearance for the animal designated as Ember. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said, his voice steady, grounded by Ember's warmth against his leg. "You may proceed," Vargas said, leaning back. Caleb didn't need notes. Every moment with Ember was etched into his memory. 3 months ago, I was barely functioning, he began, his tone honest but controlled. Night terrors, hypervigilance, isolation. I'd been avoiding therapy, avoiding myself. Then I met Ember at the Tidewater Animal Shelter. He gestured to the thick folder on the table, containing her vet records, training logs, and Dr. Miles's evaluation. She was a rescue from a neglectful breeder, used to produce litters in cruel conditions. She had physical scars, psychological, trauma, and no reason to trust anyone, but she chose me. He described their first meeting, how Ember, who'd shunned all contact, had limped to him and rested her head on his boot. He detailed her progress, learning hand signals, gaining weight, her limp fading, and her uncanny ability to sense his distress. "She wakes me before nightmares peak," he said, his voice softening. "She presses against me during panic attacks, helps me breathe. She's not just a puppy, she's my anchor." Ember shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing his leg, and Caleb drew strength from the contact. He recounted the crisis, her removal to the holding facility, her escape, her desperate journey to find him. "She tracked me across town, injured and scared, because she knew I needed her as much as she needed me. Our trauma responses mirror each other. We're healing together." The screen at the front of the room flickered on, and Dr. Lauren Miles appeared via video, her face composed. "Colonel Vargas," she said, "I've evaluated Captain Hart over multiple sessions. His PTSD symptoms, night terrors, anxiety, emotional withdrawal, have shown measurable improvement since partnering with Ember. She demonstrates all ESA qualifications, consistent behavior, responsiveness to commands, and a clear ability to mitigate his symptoms." Next, Dr. Sam Carter, a canine behaviorist, joined the feed. "I've assessed hundreds of support animals," he said, his tone confident. "Ember's intuitive responses to Captain Hart's stress signals are exceptional. She's functioning as a stabilizing force, not just a pet. Their bond is a textbook case for ESA certification." The board's questions were rigorous. Major Kim asked about Ember's training regimen, and Caleb explained their daily routines, demonstrating a hand signal that made Ember sit instantly. Captain Ellis probed the escape incident, and Caleb admitted the oversight but emphasized Ember's loyalty, how she'd risked everything to return to him. Colonel Vargas questioned the medical necessity, and Caleb met his gaze. "Sir, I wasn't ready to face my past until Ember gave me a reason to try. She's why I'm in therapy, why I'm here fighting for this." The room fell silent as the board deliberated. Caleb and Ember waited in the hallway, Nate and Clara joining them. "You did good," Nate said, clapping Caleb's shoulder. "Both of you." Ember pressed closer, her nose nudging Caleb's hand, and he scratched her ears, grounding himself in her warmth. The minutes stretched, each second heavy with possibility. When they were called back, Caleb's heart pounded, but Ember's steady presence kept him focused. Colonel Vargas stood holding a document. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, this board grants full emotional support animal certification to the animal designated as Ember, with special clearance for base housing and facilities." He paused, his eyes softening. "Additionally, Captain Hart's deployment orders are suspended. You'll be reassigned to a stateside training unit effective immediately. Relief flooded Caleb, his breath catching as he nodded. Thank you, sir. As they turned to leave, Major Reynolds approached, his face still stern but his nod deliberate. You fought for her, Hart, he said quietly. Good work. Outside, the sun was high, warming the air as Caleb and Ember stepped into the light. She tugged gently at her leash, ears forward, leading him away from the building's shadow. Caleb followed, each step lighter, the weight of the past weeks lifting. They'd won, not just the hearing, but a future together, a chance to heal. Ember's tail wagged, and Caleb smiled, a real one, knowing they were exactly where they belonged. The late afternoon sun bathed the Tidewater Reserve Base in a golden haze, softening the edges of its utilitarian buildings. Caleb Hart walked across a newly renovated courtyard, Ember, his Labrador Retriever puppy, trotting at his side, her ESA vest gleaming against her now lush golden fur. The hearing 2 weeks ago had changed everything. Ember's certification and Caleb's reassignment to a stateside training unit had secured their future together. But more than that, it had sparked a new mission, one that felt like a lifeline. Not just for Caleb, but for others like him. Today marked the launch of Pause for Peace, a pilot program pairing rescue puppies with veterans, and Caleb was at its heart, ready to help others find the healing he'd discovered with Ember. The program's facility was a transformed storage warehouse, its concrete walls now painted in warm beige, with large windows letting in natural light. Training mats lined one corner, while cozy chairs formed circles for group sessions. A banner above the entrance read Pause for Peace, healing through partnership in bold, clean letters. Clara from the Tidewater Animal Shelter stood at the check-in desk, her braid tucked under a program-branded cap, her clipboard already filled with names. 5 veterans, 5 puppies, she said, as Caleb approached, her eyes bright with excitement. You ready for this, Captain? Caleb nodded, his posture still carrying a Marine's discipline, but his expression was softer, more open than it had been weeks ago. Ready? He said, glancing at Ember, who sat attentively by his leg, her amber eyes scanning the room with her usual quiet vigilance. Puppies settled? Groomed and evaluated this morning, Clara confirmed, flipping through her notes. We've got a border collie mix for Sergeant Lopez, high energy for her restlessness, a golden retriever for Lieutenant Hayes, calm and steady, and the others, matched just like we planned. The courtyard began to fill with the first participants, veterans whose faces mirrored Caleb's own early days in Tidewater, tense shoulders, guarded eyes, some with visible scars, others carrying wounds no one could see. Caleb recognized the weight they bore, the way they scanned the space for exits or stood slightly apart, as if unsure they belonged. He'd been there, lost in his own darkness, until Ember had shown him a way out. Now, he was determined to pass that gift forward. Caleb gathered the group in a circle of chairs, Ember positioned just behind him, her presence a steady anchor. Welcome to Pause for Peace, he began, his voice clear but warm, stripped of the clipped edge it once held. This program is about trust and connection, no pressure, no timelines. Your puppies were chosen for you, based on your needs, your energy. They're rescues, like Ember here, and they've got their own stories. Together you'll figure out how to move forward. Clara brought out the puppies one by one, each introduction carefully orchestrated. Sergeant Lopez, a wiry woman with a restless leg bounce, met her border collie mix, Rocket, who bounded toward her with cautious curiosity. Lieutenant Hayes, a quiet man with burn scars on his hands, knelt as his golden retriever, Sunny, nosed his palm, her tail wagging slowly. Each pairing was a step toward healing, and Caleb watched with a quiet pride, guiding the veterans through basic hand signals he'd perfected with Ember, palm down for sit, a gentle wave for come. Ember was his partner in the demonstrations, moving with practiced grace. When Caleb signaled stay, she held her position, even as he tossed a toy nearby, her eyes locked on him with unwavering focus. The veterans watched, some nodding, others leaning forward, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity. It's not about perfection, Caleb said, scratching Ember's ears as she returned to his side. It's about consistency. They learn from you and you learn from them. During a break, Caleb moved among the group, offering pointers. He showed Sergeant Lopez how to soften her commands to match Rocket's skittish energy and helped Lieutenant Hayes use a treat to lure Sunny closer. Ember stayed close, her presence calming the puppies as much as the veterans. Caleb noticed a young man, Corporal Reed, sitting apart, his prosthetic arm glinting in the sunlight. His assigned puppy, a shy lab mix named Clover, kept her distance, watching him with the same hesitance Caleb had seen in Ember's early days. Caleb approached, Ember at his heel. "Clover giving you trouble?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Reed shrugged, his eyes on the ground. "She doesn't seem to like me much." "Ember wouldn't come near me at first," Caleb said, crouching to Reed's level. "Took days for her to trust me. Try this, hold your hand out, palm up, and just wait, let her choose." Reed hesitated, then extended his hand, his movements slow. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Clover inched forward, her nose twitching, and lightly touched her tongue to his fingers. Reed's breath caught, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Caleb smiled, remembering that first spark with Ember, the moment he'd realized he wasn't alone. As the session ended, the veterans gathered in the courtyard for a decompression exercise, sitting on the grass with their puppies nearby. The air was filled with soft murmurs and the occasional wag of a tail, a quiet harmony that felt like progress. Caleb sat with Ember, her head resting on his knee, and watched the pairs, Lopez laughing as Rocket chased a leaf, Hayes stroking Sunny's ears, Reed offering Clover a treat. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Clara joined him, holding a folder. "Funding proposal came through," she said quietly. "We might expand. More puppies, more veterans." Caleb nodded, his hand resting on Ember's back. "Good. There's a lot of people who need this." He looked at her, her eyes bright with the same spark that had drawn him in at the shelter. She'd saved him, and now they were saving others. It was a purpose he hadn't known he needed, one that made the future feel possible. The Pause for Peace facility hummed with quiet purpose under the soft glow of a tidewater afternoon, 3 months after its launch. The once empty halls now brimmed with life. Photos of graduated veteran puppy. Pairs lined the walls, each frame a story of trust rebuilt and wounds softened. Training schedules covered whiteboards, and the faint scent of treats mingled with coffee from the break room, where veterans swapped stories between sessions. Caleb Hart stood in the main training yard, Ember, his Labrador retriever, at his side, her ESA vest a badge of their shared journey. His tactical pants and program polo had replaced his Marine uniform, a shift that mirrored the transformation within him, from a man haunted by his past to one finding purpose in helping others heal. Today was orientation for a new group of veterans, and Caleb felt the familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility. Ember's amber eyes scanned the yard, her ears perked as she surveyed the arriving participants, her role as both partner and observer as natural as breathing. Caleb reviewed the intake files, his fingers pausing on one name. Private First Class Mia Torres, 24, former Army medic, nonverbal post-trauma, communicates via written notes. Her medical history noted severe anxiety and withdrawal following a convoy ambush, with physical scars from shrapnel and emotional ones that ran deeper. Caleb recognized the stillness described in her file, the kind he'd carried when he first met Ember, and he knew her pairing would need to be precise. The session began in the courtyard, the veterans seated in a loose circle under a canopy of cedar trees. Some fidgeted, others stared at the ground, their tension palpable. Caleb kept his voice steady, welcoming them with the same words that had become his mantra. "This is about trust, not performance. Your puppies are here to meet you where you are." Ember sat behind him, her presence a quiet reassurance as Clara introduced the first pairings, a lively husky mix for a restless sergeant, a gentle retriever for a pilot with chronic pain. Each connection sparked small moments of hope, but Caleb's attention kept drifting to Mia, who sat at the circle's edge, her dark hair falling over her face, a small notebook clutched in her lap. Mia's turn came last. Her assigned puppy, a shy Labrador mix named Hope, had been found abandoned in a storm drain. her black and gold coat matted and her ribs sharp from starvation. According to her file, Hope was cautious but curious, with a knack for sensing distress, perfect for Mia's quiet intensity. Caleb watched as Clara led Hope into the yard, the puppy's ears twitching as she scanned the group. Mia remained, still, her pencil poised over her notebook but unmoving, her eyes fixed on the ground. The first attempt at connection faltered. Hope approached Mia, her tail low, but stopped a few feet away, sensing the veteran's withdrawal. Caleb recognized the hesitation. It was Ember's wariness in those early days, the fear of trusting too soon. He signaled for Clara to pause, then crouched near Mia, keeping his distance to respect her space. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low. Mia glanced up, her eyes guarded, then nodded once, scribbling "okay" in her notebook. "Hope's a lot like my Ember was," Caleb said, gesturing to Ember, who watched from a few yards away. "Took her days to come near me. She'd been hurt, didn't know if I was safe, but she figured it out when I gave her time." He demonstrated a hand signal, palm up, fingers slightly curved. "Try this. Just hold it out. Don't look at her. Let her come to you." Mia hesitated, her hand trembling as she mimicked the gesture. Her notebook lay open, a half-written sentence trailing off. "I don't know if I can—" For several minutes, nothing happened. Hope stood frozen, her nose working, her eyes darting between Mia and the ground. The other veterans watched quietly, the air heavy with anticipation. Caleb stayed still, Ember's steady breathing beside, him a reminder to trust the process. Then, almost imperceptibly, Hope took a step forward. Her movements were delicate, testing, like a deer approaching a stream. Another step, then another, until she was close enough to stretch her neck and sniff Mia's outstretched hand. With a gentleness that made Caleb's throat tighten, Hope's tongue flicked out, brushing Mia's fingers once, then twice. Mia's breath hitched, her eyes widening, and for the first time she looked directly at Hope, her notebook forgotten. The puppy didn't retreat, instead settling closer, her tail giving a tentative wag. Caleb saw it then, the first crack in Mia's walls, the same spark he'd felt when Ember chose him in the shelter. Mia's shoulders softened, and she wrote in her notebook, her handwriting shaky but clear. "She's soft." She held the page up for Caleb, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. He nodded, his own smile mirroring hers. "Yeah, she is. You're doing great." The rest of the session unfolded in careful steps. Caleb guided Mia through basic signals, showing her how to offer Hope a treat without overwhelming her. Hope stayed close, matching Mia's quiet energy, her presence a mirror to the veteran's cautious hope. Around them, the other pairs progressed. Sergeant Lopez's husky mix chased a ball. The pilot's retriever dozed at his feet, but Mia and Hope's small victory felt like the heart of the day. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, Caleb watched Mia and Hope sit together under a cedar tree. Mia traced a finger along Hope's ear, her notebook open but unwritten, as if words weren't needed anymore. Ember nudged Caleb's hand, her warmth grounding him, and he scratched her ears, remembering their own first moments of trust. This was why he was here, not just for himself but for moments like this, where a puppy and a veteran found each other in the dark. The Tidewater evening wrapped the Pause for Peace facility in a gentle hush, the sky deepening to a velvet indigo as stars began to prick through. Caleb Hart stood on the training field behind the center, the cool grass brushing his boots. Ember, his Labrador retriever, stretched out beside him. Her ESA vest lay folded in the office, her golden fur catching the moonlight as she rested her head on his knee, her amber eyes half closed but ever watchful. 6 months had passed since the hearing that secured their bond, and in that time, Pause for Peace had grown from a pilot program into a beacon of hope, its walls now a tapestry of stories, photos of veterans and their puppies, each pair a testament to healing found in trust. The field was quiet now, the day's training sessions over, but Caleb could still feel the energy of the hours before. The latest group of veterans had gathered here for their final decompression exercise, a ritual that had become the program's heart. They'd sat in a loose circle, their puppies sprawled nearby, the air filled with soft laughter and the rustle of tales. Mia Torres, the non-verbal veteran from the last intake, had been among them, her shy lab mix, Hope, curled at her side. Mia's notebook was less frequent now, her smiles more open, and today she'd written a single word for Caleb. Thanks. The memory of her progress, and that of others like her, warmed Caleb against the evening chill. The facility itself had transformed. The once stark warehouse was now a haven, its halls lined with bulletin boards showcasing milestones. Sergeant Lopez and her husky mix, Rocket, completing a charity walk. Lieutenant Hayes and his retriever, Sunny, visiting schools to share their story. A new grant had expanded the program, adding kennels and a therapy room, and Clara's clipboard was always full, her grin wider with each new pairing. Caleb, too, had changed. His marine bearing remained, but his shoulders were looser, his eyes brighter, the weight of his past no longer a chain, but a story he was learning to carry. He thought of the early days with Ember, when he'd been a ghost in Tidewater, haunted by a deployment that had cost him too much. The boy's face from that mission still visited his dreams, but Ember's nudges and therapy with Dr. Miles had dulled its sting. She'd saved him, not by erasing the pain, but by showing him how to live with it, how to trust again. Now as an instructor, he saw that gift ripple outward, each veteran puppy pair a new thread in a tapestry of healing. Caleb's gaze drifted to the field, where after images of the day lingered. He could see Mia and Hope under the cedar tree, their quiet bond a mirror of his own with Ember. He saw Corporal Reed, whose prosthetic arm no longer seemed a barrier, tossing a ball for Clover with a grin. The veterans had arrived carrying their own ghosts, but here with their puppies they'd found moments of peace. Laughter as a puppy chased a leaf, stillness as a hand rested on fur, hope in a tail's wag. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. And Caleb knew better than most how much that mattered. Ember shifted, her nose nudging his hand, and Caleb smiled, scratching behind her ears. "You started this, you know," he murmured, his voice soft in the night. Her tail thumped once, as if she understood. He thought of their first meeting in the shelter, her scarred body and wary eyes, the way she'd chosen him despite her fear. That choice had led them here, to a field silvered by moonlight, surrounded by a community they'd helped build. Clara's voice broke the silence, soft as she approached from the facility. "Paperwork's done for the night," she said, settling on the grass nearby, a folder tucked under her arm. "Got a new batch of applications, 10 more veterans already vetted. We're gonna need a bigger yard soon." Caleb chuckled, the sound easier than it used to be. "We'll make it work." He glanced at the folder, its edges crisp with possibility. "Any tough cases?" "A few," Clara admitted, "but we've got you and Ember. If you can handle what you did, we can handle anything." Caleb looked at Ember, her steady presence a reminder of how far they'd come. "She did the heavy lifting," he said, and Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the field. They sat in companionable silence, the night air cool and fragrant with cedar and salt. Somewhere in the distance, a wave crashed, its rhythm blending with the soft breaths of Ember and the faint hum of the facility behind them. The stars grew brighter, and Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. This field, this program, this moment, it was home not just for him and Ember, but for every veteran and puppy who'd walked through those doors. They were survivors, all of them, learning to trust, to heal, to move forward together. Ember's warmth against his leg was a promise that they'd keep going. One step, one wag, one bond at a time. A year had passed since the launch of Pause for Peace, and the Tidewater evening glowed with the soft amber of late summer, the ocean's murmur, a gentle underscore to the hum of activity at the expanded facility. Caleb Hart stood at the edge of the training field, now doubled in size to accommodate the program's growth, watching a new group of veterans and their puppies move through a trust-building exercise. Ember, his Labrador retriever, lay beside him, her golden fur silvered by moonlight, her ESA vest retired, but her role as the program's heart as vital as ever. Her amber eyes followed the pairs with the same quiet vigilance she'd shown Caleb in their earliest days, a steady presence that had transformed not just his life, but countless others. The Pause for Peace facility was unrecognizable from its warehouse origins. A second building had been added, its cedar-shingled walls blending with the coastal landscape, housing a therapy wing and a kennel for incoming rescues. The main hall was a gallery of triumphs. Photos of graduated pairs covered every inch. From Sergeant Lopez and Rocket running a marathon to Mia Torres and Hope visiting VA hospitals. Mia's notebook now a tool for advocacy rather than necessity. A community garden bloomed where a parking lot once stood, tended by veterans and their puppies. Its flowers a riot of color against the green. Grants and donations poured in, and Pause for Peace had become a model for similar programs nationwide, its name synonymous with healing through connection. Caleb, now the program's lead instructor, wore a polo with the Pause for Peace logo, his marine precision softened by a warmth that drew veterans to him. He'd continued therapy with Dr. Lauren Miles, not just for the ESA certification, but for himself, learning to carry the memory of his last deployment, the boy, the choice, without letting it define him. Ember had been the spark, her trust showing him that healing was possible, and now he paid it forward, guiding others through their own darkness. Tonight's session was special, a graduation ceremony for the latest cohort. The field was strung with fairy lights, their glow reflecting off the faces of veterans, staff, and families gathered in folding chairs. Clara, her braid now streaked with more silver, stood at a podium, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just progress but partnership," she said, gesturing to the 10 veterans lined up with their puppies. "These pairs have shown us what trust can do. Let's honor them." One by one, the veterans stepped forward, their puppies at their heels. A former sniper with a steady-eyed shepherd mix accepted a certificate, his once rigid posture relaxed. A medic with a playful retriever mix grinned as her puppy tugged at the leash, earning a laugh from the crowd. Caleb's chest swelled with pride, but his eyes kept drifting to Mia Torres, who stood at the end of the line, hope pressed against her leg. Mia's journey had been slow, her nonverbal communication a challenge, but she'd found her voice. Through Hope, now writing blogs about their work with other veterans. As she accepted her certificate, she held up a note. "We're just getting started." The crowd applauded, and Caleb felt Ember's tail thump against his leg, as if she, too, was cheering. After the ceremony, the field became a celebration. Veterans mingled, sharing stories over lemonade and treats, while puppies romped in the grass. Caleb moved among them, offering handshakes and advice, Ember trailing him like a shadow. He paused. By Mia, who was showing Hope's tricks to a group of kids. "You're a natural," Caleb said, nodding at Hope's perfect sit. Mia smiled, writing quickly. "She taught me more than I taught her." She glanced at Ember, then added, "Like you and her?" Caleb chuckled, scratching Ember's ears. "Yeah, she's the boss." Mia's laugh was soft, a sound that had been rare months ago, and Caleb felt a quiet gratitude for the ripple effect of his and Ember's bond. As the night deepened, Caleb and Ember wandered to the field's edge, where the ocean's rhythm blended with the fading chatter. He sat cross-legged, Ember curling beside him, her head on his thigh. The stars were bright, a map of possibilities above, and Caleb thought of the shelter kennel where it all began. Ember's wary eyes, her scarred body, the moment she'd chosen him. That choice had led to this, a community of survivors, human and canine, building something stronger than their pain. Clara joined him, carrying a new folder. "Next cohort's files," she said, settling nearby, "and a proposal. Pause for Peace might go national. You up for training instructors?" Caleb looked at Ember, her steady breathing a reminder of what they'd overcome. "If it means more like this," he said, gesturing to the field, "count me in." Clara grinned, then left him to the quiet. Caleb ran his hand over Ember's, fur feeling the scars beneath, a map of her survival that matched his own. "You saved me so we could save them," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ember's tail thumped, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, Caleb knew they'd keep going, together, always forward, carrying their legacy of healing into every life they touched.